surreal that I'm a PI of a lab when it feels like only yesterday I didn't even know what a PI was? And so, what is a PI? A PI stands for a principal or primary investigator. It's basically the head of the lab. It's the person who is kind of having the bigger overall vision of the lab and offering mentorship and guidance, bringing in funding, this sorts of thing. But that's far from the only person in the lab, and it's far from the person that's really powering the lab. The day-to-day work is often done by the workers in the lab, people like undergraduates, grad students, postdocs, so postdoctoral research assistants, research technicians, staff scientists. All these various people contribute to the workings of a lab. Now, how many of these people and at what kind of positions they have is going to depend on the research setting. So where I'm at a primarily undergraduate institution in the sciences, so a PUI, so we only have undergraduate students working in our labs. However, when I was at an R1 institution, so like a research-heavy institution, there you have a lot more of those other types of people in the lab, and they can do a lot more powerful work because you have more people, you've got more money, you've got more equipment, and all of these things. So let's talk about what each of these people in a lab does. The undergrads. Depending on where you are, these undergrads will either be washing dishes or they'll be doing real science. And so if you are an undergrad and you want to really do real science, the place to go is often going to be one of those PUIs. So one of those places where the undergraduates are really the stars of the show when it comes to the day-to-day work at the lab. In those situations, the PI is actually more hands-on with the students in the lab, which is one of the reasons why I love being a PI at one of these PUIs. And so there's often less equipment at one of these PUIs, less resources, but you get to really have that experience of being a scientist and as an undergraduate kind of conducting the whole research process. However, at a larger institution, that whole research process is typically going to be carried out by the more senior researchers who might then offer mentorship of the undergraduates, as opposed to the PI being hands-on at the bench offering that mentorship. Instead, the PI might be having weekly or bi-weekly or monthly meetings or something with the trainees in their lab. So the undergraduates are kind of the bottom rung of the kind of students and things. Then you have the grad students. Now the graduate students might be rotation students or they might be kind of permanent students in the lab. So often how it works, especially with biomedical science programs, is that graduate students will apply to a program rather than applying to an individual lab. When they're in that program, they'll typically do some courses and they'll have several rotations where they basically go and try out several labs. Depending on the program, they might be doing classes at the same time, or they might be having a more intensive lab experience separated from the classes. So when I did my grad school program at Coldspur Harbor Laboratory, we had it separated. So we did kind of shorter, more intensive research rotations, and then we after we had our classes, whereas at other places you might have kind of less hours in the lab but at the same time that you're taking your courses. So that all depends on the program. Then you choose your lab, and so then you're in that lab full time, and sometimes though you're still taking some classes. It depends, but then in the later years you're basically just doing your research. You might have some teaching responsibilities too. That's going to typically be like TAing and stuff, depending on the institution that you're at. Now, people graduate. You graduate from grad school, now what? So a lot of people, their now what is to take a postdoctoral or postdoc position, sometimes called a postdoctoral fellowship, postdoctoral researcher. There's a bunch of different names, and some of the naming depends on kind of where your funding source is coming from. The postdoctoral researchers, they're typically doing research in a different lab than they got their PhD from, and they are doing it for a variety of reasons, and so it depends on the person. They might be trying to pick up a new skill, learn a new area, or they might be trying to just kind of kill some time doing some work while they try to find a more permanent position. As opposed to the students who typically just have one main project that they're working on, they might have a couple backup projects in the works just in case, but they typically have that one main project that they're focused on. The postdocs, however, usually have several projects that they're working on, and they might have several students that they are mentoring. So there's a lot more responsibility that comes with the postdoc, and it's not all just about what's in it for me. Sometimes they might be there so long that they kind of turn into a senior scientist position. So there are various names for different positions in labs, and some of that just depends on the program, depending on like how long a person has been in a lab, the types of responsibilities that they might have. One of those senior scientists, though, they're still typically doing more of the experimental design, the day-to-day thinking out of the experiments and all these things, as opposed to a research technician or a research assistant. Those people are more kind of usually entry-level jobs into a lab, and so sometimes people can get these jobs straight out of getting like their undergraduate degree or maybe a master's, and here they're kind of more following instructions from those other researchers in the lab that are really having more of the direct experimental design. Depending on the experience of the research technician or the research assistant, as well as kind of the nature of the lab, they may be given more or less responsibility. And so that all just depends, and they can definitely offer real intellectual contributions to the lab. So I don't want to downplay their importance at all. But that is more of a kind of traditional job than one of these grad students, senior scientists, postdocs, where the hours are really weird and stuff. With a research technician, a research assistant, you typically have more defined hours and that sort of thing. That can be a really good job, entry job into a lab, as well as a way to get more research experience if you're trying to think about whether grad school might be right for you, or just to get more experience for your applications. Because if you apply to grad school, they're typically really going to be looking for that research experience. And so that research experience, you can get that through one of these research assistants, research technician jobs. And so there are different like job forms and things that you can look for to see if people have those positions available, and then go apply for them. And then you can get those skills that you need to hopefully become a grad student if you want to become a grad student. And then remember, after a grad student, you can do a postdoc. You don't have to do a postdoc. People typically do a postdoc if they're wanting to go into academia. So if they're wanting to go on and say become a PI, become a primary investigator. But if you want to go and do something like maybe you want to go into science writing, you want to go into law, you want to go into all these things, there are various avenues that you can take that don't require a postdoc. So a postdoc is by no means necessary, but most of the academic positions, if you want to go be a PI and stuff, they are going to expect you to have some of those postdoc experiences. Although there are some like fellowship programs where they accept people that are like rising stars or whatever right after of their graduate work. And so sometimes how you find the postdoc is just looking for various positions, or a lot of it is kind of word of mouth, and your PI knows somebody who knows somebody, and blah, blah, blah. One of the things to consider when you're choosing a lab for grad school is that grad school is really about learning to be a scientist. It's not about learning a specific skill. It's not about learning a specific topic. And you're probably not going to be able to research anything very, very close to the research that you were doing when you were a grad student, or even when you were a postdoc, because you would then be a competitor of the lab. And so typically you want to choose a lab that's going to just be really supportive. And so in grad school, it's really about learning how to be a scientist, this process of being a scientist. In your postdoc, now you might be trying to pick up some actual skills, but again, it's not the project that you're typically going to be working your life on. And so you just need to make sure that the people around you are really supportive, and that is kind of the crucial thing. And a big part of that support comes from the trainees in the lab, as well as from the PI. So I feel it's my responsibility as a PI to really set a positive tone in the lab, a supportive tone in the lab, and be able to provide that mentorship. I have the privilege of being able to work like hands on hands with students in the lab, but a larger institution, the PI is typically going to have a ton more meetings. They have to be pulling in more grant money and all these things. And so then a lot of that mentorship is passed on to people like those postdoctoral researchers who have to then mentor the undergraduates. Sometimes people can have negative experiences. They can be in like toxic labs and stuff. And this can make it so that they kind of want to be mean to the people after them, because they want to kind of get out some of that, like people were mean to me, I get to be mean to people now. But please don't be that person. Remember that older you who didn't even know what a PI was. Remember that older you who was confused in the lab. Keep those instances in your mind. I try to do that, keep everything I was confused about in my head, and make sure that those things I actually explain to the people that I'm training. And I address the fears in them that I feel that they might have but won't be expressing, because I know that I had those fears, I had those concerns, I had those kind of questions, or those what's that? Like what's a PI in my head when I was a student. And so I always try to address those things. Being at a PUI, my students don't have kind of the exposure to all these different people in a lab, and so I try to bring that in whenever I can and expose them to the types of people that are in a lab. So not just the undergraduates, but the grad students and the postdocs and the research techs and the research assistants. There are also people like senior scientists. There are staff scientists where people get hired to kind of be a lifelong postdoc type of thing, where they have more say in their research, but they don't have to worry about bringing in the grant money and doing all that PI stuff. And so that's great if you really just want to be research heavy on things and you don't want to have to do all that administrative work, but then you still don't get to choose the overall direction of the lab, but you do have more of a say in kind of the day-to-day experiments that you do as a scientist. There are different kind of ranks of hierarchies of assistants and senior scientists and technicians, depending on the types of experiments you do and how much experience you have. And so you can actually kind of earn your way up to a larger salary in some of those positions. And a lot of this is just what your preference is and what the availability is in different labs. In addition to all those people doing the work day to day in the lab, there's often also lab managers who are helping with all the coordination as well as buying things. You might have, like, depending on where you're at, there might be like stockroom managers, there might be core facilities. So sometimes if you're at a larger institution, they'll have core facilities for things like sequencing or cryo-EM. So these techniques that require this big fancy equipment that's really expensive and a lot of different labs want. And so instead of just having every lab have to have their own piece of zillion-dollar equipment, you have core facilities where people are trained in running that equipment, and then the people from the different labs can kind of hire them to run their samples for them. And so you'll have core facility people that are going to be kind of directing the show there, as well as workers there that are then going to be doing things like running the actual samples that were prepared by the people in the individual labs. You'll also often have equipment to prepare people in the different labs, as well as people from companies that'll come out and fix your equipment if it breaks down. There are people that can help with grant writing, as well as kind of navigating through the grant system, getting the publishing all figured out and stuff. It all just depends on kind of how big the institution you're at is, what the amount of research that's done there is. And so one of those like R1 institutions where it's like research heavy, those are the places where you're really going to be getting a lot of that sort of auxiliary staff. And you cannot forget the facilities and maintenance workers who really make everything possible. So they're often undervalued, so be sure to thank them. Thank you, thank you, thank you. There's people just behind the scenes doing all of that stuff that makes all that we do possible. And so thank you, thank you, thank you. Also know that the roles will vary in different labs. The titles might vary in different labs. And so you always want to look at the job descriptions, talk to the people in the lab, and get a feel for the lab and the positions. Your mileage may vary, but hopefully this kind of helped to demystify a bit of the academic science realm for people who were like me a few years ago and were like, what the heck is a PI? And so I try to introduce my students to all these people through things like when we're talking about citing papers, talk about how that first author on a paper is often going to be the person that is actually doing the work hands-on at the lab. So people like your grad students or your postdocs. Whereas that last author, that senior author, that corresponding author who you correspond with if you have questions about the paper, that is often going to be the PI, the principal investigator, the primary investigator. The people like me, although it still feels weird that I'm a PI. And being a PI at a PUI is a lot different than being a PI at an R1. And that's one of the reasons why I love it, is because I get to still be hands-on at the lab with students. And I love being hands-on in the lab with students because as much as I love doing research, I love teaching people to do research and seeing them get to see that exciting results and seeing them get excited about their results. And so just really grateful.